I'm Jonah Goldberg. I'm a fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute, amongst other things. And I'm delighted to invite you here to discuss one of my weird lifelong obsessions, expanding Congress and the case for doing so. I will spare you, why I'm obsessed with this for later in the discussion. And so let's just get started. I want to say thank you for joining this event hosted by the American Enterprise Institute and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. On December 9, the American Academy for Arts and Sciences published a report entitled "The Case for Enlarging the House of Representatives," and it was authored by Lee Drutman, AI's Yuval Levin and Norman Ornstein, and the Academy's Jonathan Cohen. So today we will be discussing the findings of that report, which I should say that report expanded on the recommendations put forth in the project Our Common Purpose, Reinventing American Democracy for the 21st Century. So our guests today are Ruth Block Rubin. She's an assistant professor in the political science department at the University of Chicago. Lee Drutman is a senior fellow in the political reform program at New America. Kevin Kosar is a senior fellow and my colleague here at the American Enterprise Institute. And Yuval Levin is the director of social, cultural, and constitutional studies here at AEI and editor-in-chief of National Affairs and my direct supervisor. So not only is he a handsome man, he's a powerful man. So we're going to sort of kick off. I just to explain why this is an obsession of mine. The first piece I ever got published in a mainstream publication anywhere was my argument for expanding the House of Representatives, which appeared in the Wall Street Journal the day after the 1992 presidential election. And it's sort of been my white whale ever since. But these guys have actually put real work into it, which I have not. And so we're going to begin with Lee Drutman walking us through the outlines in the case for why we might want to expand the House of Representatives. So I hand it to you, Lee.
All right. Well, thank you, Jonah. And I do hope that the fate of this quest doesn't wind up like most of the crew that went out for Ahab's white whale, but that we are a little bit more successful. And I think we can be. So briefly, the argument for expanding the House might be distilled down to three words. It's about time. It has been over 100 years since the House last increased its membership, which it had done previously almost after every census as the country got bigger and bigger. But for complicated reasons in the 1910s and 1920s, Congress couldn't agree on a formulation for increasing the size of the House. So it fixed it at a totally arbitrary number of 435. And the original Congress was only 65 members. And the idea of the House of Representatives was that we should have an institution of governing that is close to the people, in which you have members who represent smaller, communities, constituencies in which they could actually kind of get to know those people and really kind of understand how they think, and also sort of offer themselves up as real ambassadors to government in Washington, so that people could feel somewhat connected to their government and the government could feel somewhat connected to the people. Now, in 1911, there were about 200,000 constituents per representative. That was way up from the original 30,000 that Madison had envisioned and implemented in the first Congress. So now we are at about 750,000, which is really a lot of people. And it's very hard to envision one person as the tribune close to the people of so many people. And what we wind up with is a kind of abstracted and rather, I think, a limited view of representation, and that loses a lot of the richness and diversity of this rich and diverse nation. So I think we ought to take seriously the idea of increasing the size of the House of Representatives to get it back more in line with what the purpose of a people's house ought to be. The U.S. has far lagged behind other comparable democracies in terms of the ratio of constituents to representatives. And I think that is contributing to some of the poor quality of representation we see in our contemporary Congress. So the proposal we put forward would increase the size of the House to 585 members from the current 435. I think that's a pretty reasonable increase. And what the way that we come up with that formula is basically to say, well, what would have happened if the House had taken the following rule starting in 1911, which is that, or really with the 1911, which is to say that no state should lose representation. That's a pretty modest proposal, that basically we should expand the House as the census population counts increase, so that no state has to give up a representative, and that would take us to 585 today. So I think it's a pretty modest increase, but it would bring in a new generation of talented lawmakers. I think that the one advantage of expanding the House is it just expands the number of people who are able to get into government and bring their talents to Washington. I think it would also probably create the way for some decentralization, although I know there's some debate over that point in which committees and subcommittees might be able to have more of a role in governing, because as the size increases, it becomes harder for any one party leader to kind of dominate. But so those are kind of some initial thoughts, initial rationales, and I look forward to having a spirited discussion with my brilliant colleagues here.
So Yuval, one of the hallmarks, one of the central focuses of AI these days, or at least your department, is to catalog all the different ways in which Congress is broken, and all of the different dysfunctions that Congress has. And you've written a lot about how people get elected to Congress these days to be, performative actors rather than institutionalists who are trying to work within the institution to yield positive results. Would this touch any of that? Is there any reason to believe that we would get fewer Matt Gaetzes and more? I apologize, I can't right now conjure a name of a really responsible, decent congressperson, but I'm sure they exist. Run through the ways this would help. I take the point about representation and all that, and I agree with it. But as an institutional matter, what are the other factors? What are the other dysfunctions that Congress is plagued by, and how would this affect some of them?
I'd say a few things, Jonah. First of all, I do think it's important to stress the point that Lee made, which I would say is basically that this is not a radical reform of the functioning of the institutions. This is more like constitutional maintenance. Expanding the House as the population grows was something that the Constitution envisions happening on a regular basis after every census. It's not stated in the Constitution that that's what the census is meant to drive, but it certainly seemed like the assumption of the framers. Madison says in Federalist 58 that that's the purpose of the decennial census. And the Congress did grow that way every 10 years until the 1920 census, when it didn't. So that part of what we would want to do here is get back to work on that front. And in a sense, think of this as constitutional maintenance, as work that needed to be done. It's also part of the logic of 150 as the size of the expansion. This is where the House would be if we had continued to grow by basically the same formula by which it was growing in the 19th century. But beyond that, I do think that there's a way, and so that's to say, this is not a radical reform, and we would not suggest that by itself it will radically transform the culture of the House. But there are a couple of ways that it would help. I think, first of all, part of what happens in the House now is that in the absence of relatively fine-grained representation, we're seeing a decline in intra-party factions and the breakdown of the House into two very broad and distinct party coalitions, where each coalition is internally very coherent. And there is a way of seeing the kind of change that this could drive as enabling some more diversity within the party coalitions, and therefore a more functional House, a House where there's more likely to be cross-partisan bargaining because there's more likely to be intra-partisan divisions. Now, we're not sure, right? You can't really predict that that's exactly what would happen. And there's certainly an argument. I think the strongest critique of the notion of increasing the size of the House is that it would actually intensify centralization, that there would be more members, and therefore each member would in a sense, be worth less, and leaders would have more power rather than less. I think the nature of centralization, the historical forces that have been driving it are such that that's the less likely outcome of this kind of change. But it is certainly possible. A further way to think about how this relates to other changes, though, is that this creates a moment of change in the House. 150 new members all at once creates a situation where members are simply more likely to think about how else the House needs to change. The House of Representatives, in a couple of historical moments, we can think of particularly two in the 20th century, in 1946 and in 1973 and 4, members reached a point where they thought this is not working and we need fundamental changes. They changed the committee system, they changed the role of leadership, they changed the budget process in the 70s. It's time for a moment like that because the House is dysfunctional in ways that are distinct to this moment, to a time where the House is closely divided, control swings back and forth, which was not the case in the 1970s or in the 1940s. And it's time to think about how the House should work now. I think one reason for me to support this kind of change is that it's a modest step that could lead to those greater steps. It could create a moment where 150 new members enter all at once, and members in general think, well, what else needs to change right now? Maybe this is the moment to think about how the House could work better. So I don't think it's a magic bullet. I don't think that by itself it would transform all the problems that we see or the incentives that face members. But if we ask ourselves, why are those not changing now? The sheer power of standing inertia has a lot to do with it. The sense that members have that things can't change. You talk to members at this point, none of them are very happy with the status quo. No one says, this place is great. I want to stay here forever. And yet you say to them, what don't you like? And they talk about the schedule and the budget. And you think, well, you could change the schedule and the budget. That's just up to you. That's a thought that has not occurred to a lot of backbench members. And I think by creating a moment of change, you at least stand a better chance, if reformers are prepared for it, to enable those other changes to also happen. So it's a change that's good in itself, but might also drive others.
So, Ruth, Yuval's nobody's idea of a Jacobin, but does any of this make you nervous? What are some of the reservations that you might have? And do you agree with Yuval's case that the sharpest critique of this is that it would just increase centralization, or are there sharper critiques to be found?
Well, not everyone has a problem with centralization, so I would say that's a complicated pitch, but certainly one that I think would be a concern for individual lawmakers in actually getting a reform like this off the ground. I would say, I think one of the most compelling features of the report is simply pointing out that the quality of representation has declined precipitously over the course of the past 100 years. And that's, I think, something that should upset every American. And the amount of work that we're asking members of Congress to do has increased exponentially as a result. And so that just simply stating the problem in those terms is, I think, incredibly important. I think political scientists are famously bad at predicting how institutions will respond to institutional changes of this sort. And so we're all flying up by the seat of our pants somewhat. I do think it's clear that when you see more centralized decision-making in legislative bodies that are larger, and for some people that's going to be a problem. I think for others, you might say having stronger leaders would ensure that party discipline and that the kind of rambunctious, to put it kindly, behavior of individual members is not given as free rein as it is currently. And so actually strengthening the hands of leaders might be a productive consequence of this reform. I think it's interesting to think about what the effects on the committee system would be. Certainly, you might imagine that there's a ceiling on just how much power leaders are able to hold in their hands. And so I think the report suggests that some decentralization might flow to committees and you might get more expert policymaking, and all of that sounds super appealing. Whether in fact that's a possibility is a different question altogether. I think the strongest critique of this proposal, and one that I personally don't find all that satisfying, but I think is one that people might reasonably have, is like, why start with the House? When you think about the dysfunction in Congress, I think folks often look to the Senate it's malapportionment, it's rules which clearly favor minoritarian politics, and say, why are we starting with the House? The House, at least over the past couple of years, has shown that it can get things done, and really the problem is the Senate. There are many reasons why actually targeting reform in the Senate is perhaps more difficult, certainly more difficult, and maybe not feasible at all. And so for that reason, I think the claim that we should start with the Senate simply because it is the worst of the two chambers of Congress is not particularly persuasive. I think one of the things that's interesting is whether, the report makes the case that expanding the size of the House doesn't have an obvious partisan valence. I guess my concern is that very little that is at all important doesn't come to take on a partisan valence, whether it is deserved or not. And so just in terms of thinking about the feasibility of a reform like this, one has to worry that members will come to see that there are winners and losers, and that in and of itself is going to make something like this really difficult to achieve, even if the problem that the report identifies is a grave one and one that we should all be concerned about.
Ruth raises an interesting point, Kevin, that I was thinking about this in the context of the recent Supreme Court commission that Biden put together and that our colleague Adam White was on. And when I was reading through it, it seemed to me that the only way I could get behind some of the changes, and I'm not necessarily saying I'm in favor of them, is that if you did it far enough out that you couldn't predict a partisan advantage one way or the other. If you said, okay, in 10 years the size of the court is going to be X, or in 10 years we're to implement term limits on judges, that at least doesn't allow for immediate game playing and that kind of thing. And so when I was listening to Ruth about this, I had thought that maybe one of the chief advantages of this is that you can't identify a clear partisan advantage for one side or the other in doing this, and that might make it more possible to happen. And then you realize, I think Ruth makes a good point, which is that if they can make wearing masks so partisan, they can make anything really partisan. And so it's entirely possible that it would be fun to listen to the populists in the House talk about how we don't need any more people here. But what are the chances, what are the actual obstacles to getting this thing done? Is it this partisan calculation? Is it this sort of a public choice self-interest thing that they don't want to dilute their power? How would you do it?
Well, I think there's a few challenges that immediately come to mind. First, I'm not sure present chamber leadership wants to hear anything about this. It's more cats to wrangle. They tend to prefer stasis. Don't change the rules. Don't change the structures, because I know the rules. I've mastered them and I can work through these structures. You move parts and that makes my life harder. So you've got leadership as a problem. Second issue is that you're going to have to, not only educate the kind of influencers in DC about the merits and the challenges of this enterprise, but also the broader American public. The sales pitch here could be misconstrued as, hey, America, we can make governance better. We're going to give you more politicians. That's not going to please or sell particularly well out there in the heartland. So I think you need to get past that sort of stuff so that you can help folks see why this is actually a populist thing to do and how this actually benefits members, or not just members, but benefits the members of the public. And I would think that in part, you'd want to frame this in terms of congressional capacity. Your average member of the public does not feel particularly well heard by their member of Congress. Not surprising. If you're one of 750,000 or whatever it is, how likely are you to be heard? You're just not. So the idea is that, this is going to up the odds that your voice could actually be heard. Second thing is that the public should, be better informed about, a key role of members of Congress, which is to serve as a kind of citizen ombudsman to the executive branch. I mean, Americans often find themselves frustrated at government, and what they're frustrated first and foremost with is some good or service or situation involving an executive branch, a Social Security check that didn't show up, what have you. members of Congress frequently are the ones going to bat for the public to try to solve these things. Constituent service is a huge enterprise that's carried out by every member's office in the House of Representatives. And we only got 435. And you've got an executive branch that's 180 agencies, you know, and the budget of it is what, 4 trillion, 6 trillion? I'm not even sure how many trillions we're up to right now. 435 people to directly go after the executive branch and fight on behalf of members of the public is not a whole lot. You know, it's the same amount as it was 100 years ago when the government was a lot smaller. So those things are upfront things that I think would really need to be tackled in order for this to become a serious governance reform conversation more broadly in the country.
All right, so I want to encourage everybody. You know, what is it? The line from Dr. Strangelove? There's no fighting in the war room. You guys are free to go after each other as much as you see fit. That said, I would like to hear from Lee a little bit about this point that Ruth makes about tackling the House first instead of the Senate. I mean, part of my response to that is that the House is actually the more directly democratic majoritarian institution, and so making it more majoritarian and democratic has a certain appeal. But you know, what do you make of that point? Is the Senate really where the dysfunction is, and is it just that it's just too hard to fix, and so you go for the low-hanging fruit with the House?
It's a good question. I mean, there's a lot that needs to be fixed about our politics, but the House has historically been an institution in which change is easier. Also, the Constitution gives the House more leverage to change things. I mean, at least when it comes to elections. But I think historically, the House has just kind of been more on the cutting edge of reforms, and I don't know. I mean, there's a lot I'd like to change about the Senate too, and maybe if we have a different composition of senators and different leadership in the Senate, we might think about that. So there's a lot we should do, but I mean, I think we should start where change is most possible. And as Yuval says, once we inject some new organization into one institution, that will probably have ripple effects, and it will lead to a new class of folks coming in with new ideas. It will, you change one thing, and maybe other things change from there. It's rare that you change a bunch of things at once in a complex political system, but sometimes even a small change at a moment in which the system is really stuck, and I think our system is really stuck, can have important downstream effects that help to unstick other aspects of the political system.
John, I think there's also a constitutional reason to do it that way, which is basically that what we're talking about here is a way of returning to how the Constitution seems to envision the House functioning and changing, rather than altering the way the Constitution envisions the chamber working. There may be arguments for making changes to how the Senate works, but the case that the House should stop growing even as the country keeps growing has never really been made. I mean, that's not the fact is we haven't done this in a century, and we should have, and that makes for a somewhat easier case. I also think if you look at the history of congressional reform, and the 46 reforms are an exception to this, they did begin in the Senate, but generally speaking, the House changes itself, and then the Senate is forced to change so that it can get legislation through that can make it through both houses. The budget reforms in the 70s began in the House. The committee reforms in the 1920s began in the House. The tremendous change in appropriations and budget policy at the end of the 19th century began in the House. It's easier to envision change in the House. Everybody's up for election every 2 years. There's a new rules package every 2 years. The Senate is just, by its nature, a more permanent body, and in a way that makes this kind of structural change a little harder to imagine. So that even if we think about changes that might ultimately drive some change in the Senate or change in the process by which the two work together, generally speaking, it's a lot easier to imagine this kind of change starting in the House.
Yeah, I mean, to use a cliched metaphor, in a log jam, you don't necessarily have to remove the biggest log, right? You move one that just shakes up the whole dynamic. I want to take a brief moment here and say that we're going to start taking questions around 1:45. It depends how scintillating things get. And if you have questions, you can tweet them with the hashtag expand the House, all one word, expand the House. Or you can email them to Michael Good with a clever spelling of MIKAEL good at aei.org. So it's mikhail.good@aei.org, or the hashtag expand the House. So I'm sorry, I have just been told it's expand the House AEI. People will be flogged. Appropriate punishments will be meted out. So it's the hashtag is expand the House AEI. So one question, when I talk about this with people, one of the points I emphasize is that we've now trained a lot of people to think gerrymandering is in and of itself very, very bad. And I think you can make that argument that it is very, very bad. But the more members of Congress that you have, the harder it is, it seems to me, to make the truly ridiculous districts, just because you're diluting this, you're shrinking the sizes of the slices of the pie, and so it's just harder to make crazy districts. Is that actually a benefit that would come from this? Because I've heard people have pushed back on me on that. And is that maybe a way to sell it? Kevin, you want to jump in on that?
Realizing that the redistricting process is often driven by algorithm software, et cetera, et cetera. These are the sort of tools that people have to work with these days. I think it's fully possible that somebody could come up with an absolutely ridiculous map, even if you had, 50 representatives from the great state of Ohio or something like that. But I think I'd rather turn this question over to Lee Drutman, who has been deep in the weeds on this stuff, and see what he has to say.
Yeah. So I don't think you can sell this as an anti-gerrymandering measure. I wish we could, but I think it's probably neutral on this. I mean, basically the problem with gerrymandering is that we have single member districts that allow a redistricting commission, partisan legislature, whoever decides the lines, to come up with 10,000, 100,000, however many simulations of or maps, and then run simulations on them, and then come up with a map that helps their side the most. And basically, as long as we have partisan legislatures drawing lines, and as long as we have single member districts where Democrats live in the cities and Republicans live outside of the cities, and the populations are distant from each other, we're going to have mostly uncompetitive districts. We're going to have lots of opportunities for gerrymandering, and the problem is going to get worse. Now, speaking of reforms that pair well with expanding the size of the House, I think moving to multi-member districts with some proportional method of allocating seats would work extremely well. I just don't think we're going to solve the problem of gerrymandering until we get rid of single member districts, which are kind of a historical anachronism that the framers never discussed or debated. In fact, we had multi-member districts in many states for the first 40, 50 years of our House elections.
Can I just ask Lee to, for listeners who are not familiar with the concept of a multi-member as opposed to what we have now, just to briefly explain that difference and how it feeds into this expanding the House?
Sure. So, right now we all vote in districts in which we elect one representative. Now, you could imagine combining 5 districts, and rather than then you electing, and then just one person representing that district, you have 5 representatives. So, maybe you have 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats. And what it means is that everybody gets a vote that counts in those districts, and it also becomes harder to gerrymander. I mean, this is what most democracies do: is they have larger multi-member districts in which there's multiple representatives representing a single larger district. Votes are allocated proportionally, so that if 60% of the people in the district want a Republican to serve them, to represent them, then 3 out of the 5 seats go to Republicans and 2 out of the 5 seats go to Democrats. On the other hand, we have crazy things like the state of Massachusetts, in which it's 2/3 Democrat, but the entire state of Massachusetts does not have a single Republican representative. So if you made the entire state of Massachusetts one congressional district, you'd have 1/3 Republicans, 2/3 Democrats, or maybe you'd have some more factions emerging. And the liberal Republicans who might have who are like, Charlie Baker Republicans would have some representatives in Congress. Take that to a state like Oklahoma, maybe 40% Democrats. So we'd have some more conservative Democrats in Congress. I think that would contribute to a much more functional Congress with the kind of cross-partisan, factions that used to make Congress work. That's another recommendation of the our common purpose report, although not the focus of this particular report, by the way.
I will find someone else to moderate that panel. But you've all picking up on what Lee was saying. Can you talk for a second about why and I agree with you, but I think you're smarter than me about talking about this stuff, why having intra-party factions would benefit Congress, which I assume you would also get. I mean, Lee's representative districts would clearly contribute to more intra-party factions. But what are intra-party factions, and why are they something that we actually want?
Well, I think if you look at American political history, we've had 2 parties for most of our history. Almost any moment you look in on, you've got 2 large parties. But in most of those moments, you would have clearly discernible factions within the parties that create coalitions that reach across party over distinct issues. So a lot of the kinds of differences that are worked out through multi-party coalitions in European legislatures are worked out through factional coalitions in the American Congress. And the role that these factions play has been enormously important in advancing legislation over the course of our history. They're the reason why things don't just break down in 2 on every issue at every point all the time. We now live in a time when those kinds of factions seem almost unfamiliar, unnatural to us, and the parties are very cohesive. Members tend to understand themselves through a partisan identity, and party leaders are the only people who are kind of empowered to negotiate across party lines. Now, there are exceptions to that. We saw one with the infrastructure bill in the Senate, which I think was a great example of how this could work, where you've got 10 members of the Republican Party, 10 members of the Democratic Party. They work out a deal. The rest of their parties don't love it, but enough people vote for it, and that's now the law. I think that kind of work, which is the way that Congress can do its job is to address public problems by reaching accommodations across lines of difference. In that sense, Congress is different from a European Parliament. Its purpose is not just to empower the majority to do whatever it wants until it gets thrown out. Its purpose is to allow for the durable resolution of divisive issues through compromise, through bargaining, through accommodations. And that kind of thing requires cross-partisan coalitions, which means they require intra-party factions. I think when we think about how to reform Congress, we have to think in this moment about how to make it more likely that those kinds of intra-party factions will come into being around particular issues or broadly, regionally, and other ways that they have in our history. The absence of them now is a big part of what we consider the dysfunction of Congress as a legislative body.
So, Ruth, I want to get you back in here, and feel free to take shots at anything you've already heard, but I want to go back to one thing that you said earlier about how some people think centralization is a plus and that the House tends to get things done and it's the Senate that doesn't and all that. and I take your point. I mean, I think observationally, objectively, you're right. At the same time, though, and I'm giving up my youth, I'm revealing something a little bit about my youth and my age. If you watch the old Schoolhouse Rock cartoon about how a bill becomes a law, and you try to take, if you use that as a study guide for a civics test today that was actually reflected how bills become laws, you'd fail, because that's just not how it works anymore. You know, bills come from leadership and they don't come out until they got all the votes done. And so the mere fact that the House gets things done without getting the sort of democratic buy-in that bubbles up from below, isn't that in and of itself a sort of very abstracted ideological benefit? You know, wouldn't you rather have the rich, argy-bargy and hurly-burly of American democracy, where things are argued out at the committee level and go up through the general order, and that way there is more buy-in from the actual constituents and all that stuff?
Well, I'm happy to answer that question. I want to touch on one thing that Yuval was stressing that I just think is worth flagging, since we've made reference to political history. I think, and thinking about intra-party factions, of which I think Yuval and I are on the same page, that in general, they're incredibly important for representative democracy. But I do think we risk painting them as solely a force of good, and in particular that cross-party coalitions are always an impetus for productive progressive change or productive conservative change, however you want to think about that. But that, for the sort of heyday of cross-party coalitions, the textbook Congress, the 1950s and 1960s, where you saw a lot of collaboration between Democrats and Republicans, a lot of that collaboration was to maintain the status quo. And that was particularly right in terms of thinking about delaying the passage of civil rights legislation. So I do think we run the risk of overstating the value of cross-party coalitions to democratization in general. I think a lot of the sort of flip side to that is to say that oftentimes in American history, you've gotten productive prodding from the fringes of a party that are also well organized. So thinking about the Democratic Study Group and the analogous organizations which exist today, regardless of your politics, I think it's hard to deny that groups like the Congressional Progressive Caucus and the House Freedom Caucus have both sort of forced lawmakers to think about politics differently, and that provides an important representative angle. I think in thinking about centralization, factions matter quite a bit too. I think the conventional wisdom among political scientists is that the more divided the party, the weaker its leaders will be. The more factions and ideological heterogeneity you have, the less power that individual leaders will wield. And I think when you look at history and you look at leaders who governed deeply divided coalitions, you actually observe oftentimes the opposite. So thinking about famous speakers like Sam Rayburn, who governed coalitions that were both instantiated both conservative and liberal members, that you saw actually someone who wielded quite a great deal of influence in a variety of different ways and was responsible for an important institutional reform, which was at the time to expand the size of the House Rules Committee. And so I think it's worth thinking, and I think this just goes to say that it's really hard to know what effect increasing the strength of factions will have on both the sort of pressure to change congressional institutions, but also the effect it will have on leader power. You might wonder actually whether the leaders who seem to exert the least influence today are the ones where there is insufficient factional activity on both sides of the party equation. So thinking about the influence that conservative Republicans wield as compared to moderate Republicans, the few that remain, they're not on equal footing. And so perhaps by increasing their ranks and encouraging their organization, it would be possible to provide a counterweight both for those members and for leaders. To address the Schoolhouse Rock question, I think, it's a lovely cartoon that tells a useful story. One only sees the bill, but one doesn't know what's in it. And so there are arguments surely that you get better bills drafted when it's a joint process between members and leaders. I think if in a different time, people would be worried if you were talking a great deal about drafting legislation in committee, that this would open up the opportunity for undue influence from organized interests. You would hear reference to iron triangles and cagey bureaucrats and lobbyists, of which I'm sure Lee can tell us more. And so the committee drafting isn't necessarily substantially better or needn't be. And so how that would actually play out is, I think, very difficult to predict. But if you've read committee testimony, it doesn't necessarily fill you with a great deal of confidence that better legislation would be drafted in that format.
So it had not even occurred to me that we never know what the actual bill is proposing. And it could be a lot of fun to do a very dark sort of alternative history about what that bill actually is about, but we'll get to that another time. But in the Schoolhouse Rock vein, Kevin, in terms of committee work and the assumption that at some point committees should actually do committee work, how would they benefit or not from expanding the House?
So there's a really old saying a couple thousand years ago that to be everywhere is to be nowhere. And I guess the modern analog is if you're multitasking 3 different things, you're not doing any of them well. And inevitably in my conversation with people who work on committees in the House, it's very clear to me that they are way overtaxed doing way too many different things. And that naturally flows from the sheer size of the executive branch. The bigger the executive branch gets, the more the oversight responsibility, the more the issues that crop up, et cetera, et cetera. And so you have to talk to committee staff and, they do a deep dive on some topic and they pound away at it for a few days, but then they have to drop it and move to something else. And so their ability to stay locked into something and to work on something, to say nothing of their bosses. I mean, their bosses are even in a worse position because, their time is divided between running for re-election, doing constituent outreach, things other than policymaking and oversight. So it's just a pure numbers play. If you have more members of Congress, you're going to be able to have more committees, or at least you should have more committees. And hopefully that will lead to the people being stretched a little less thin and perhaps being able to do a little bit better. It's no guarantee that they will actually do better. People do have to have an incentive to do the job. And we know that some members of Congress think the whole point of an oversight hearing is to polish their brand and to act up and to basically fundraise. So it's no guarantee, but if you're going to have any chance at oversight being done and done well, you need to put more bodies on it one way or another.
Okay, I'm going to, I was checking out the Expand the House AEI hashtag. And Lorelei, I won't give the last name. I don't know why not. It just feels like the better course of action. How might the concept of an expanded House intersect with the recommendations of the the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress, which will focus on implementation in 2022? Devolving functions, not necessarily decentralizing, is tantalizing in a digital evolution, especially with COVID rules. Thanks. So that was from Lorelei. Why don't we go to Lee? Because I'm not sure I understand the question, but I feel like there's a real question in there.
Yeah, I'm not sure entirely. There's a lot in there. Somewhere there's a pony in there. No, I'm just teasing. I mean, we should sing the praises of the House Committee on Modernization, which has been doing, yeoman's work on trying to think about how the House can function better. I don't know. I mean, I would guess if you have 150 new members, they are going to be setting up offices for the first time and are looking for guidance. So it's probably more likely to see some of those types of recommendations for how members should run their office and how Congress should operate from people who are new as opposed to people who've been there for a long time. So, I don't know. I mean, my sense is, there's a lot of low hanging fruit in terms of how Congress could operate better as an institution, but a lot of the challenges flow from the fact that in a highly centralized, leadership-driven institution, on top of highly partisan, polarized, zero-sum, scorched earth politics, it's really hard for the House to work as a particularly functional institution, or for Congress more broadly to work. I mean, the House is just one institution in a broader, ecosystem of our complicated and layered government.
Okay, so we got a few questions. I got a couple questions about campaigns and the cost of elections. I'm not sure I agree with the premises on some of these, but I'll read two of them, and you guys can. I'll just drop the hockey puck. Miriam's asks, if we expand the House, the costs of elections will also expand. Can House members have 4-year terms to keep this from costing a fortune? And then George asks, I appreciate Ruth's comment that the work of Congress has increased exponentially in the last 100 years, but wouldn't expanding the House increase the number of people spending their time raising money for their next campaign rather than governing? So clearly campaign costs are something that this is a concern for people. Anybody want to jump in on either of those?
Well, I guess I would just say this could easily cut both ways. I mean, smaller districts could easily lead to less costly campaigns per district. If you've got to cover less ground, you're likely to have fewer media markets. You're likely to need less outreach, and so you can imagine it. I don't think that I would confidently predict that on the whole, a larger House would reduce the cost of election to the House. But I don't think that it would necessarily change it in any dramatic way. The second question just says, aren't we just going to have more House members, and aren't House members just the worst people in America? And that's certainly a concern. In some ways they plainly are. And we would have more members of the House, so that if the problem is just these damn people, then fewer of them might be better than more of them. But I think you have to think about the incentives that drive their behavior, right? These are ambitious men and women. They're smart men and women. They're behaving the way they're behaving for a reason. And that reason has to do with how they can channel their ambition in directions that lead to success. And the answer to that question is in part a function of the structure of the institution. What is success in the House? How do you make your name? How do you advance? That has to do with a lot of things. It has to do with the broader media culture, which this couldn't change. But it also has to do with the way the House works, with what members spend their time doing, with whether committee work makes any difference, with how you advance down the lines. And on that front, I do think that institutional reforms like this can make a difference. So that part of the reason for thinking about them is how do we create incentives that can help members of the House just be better legislators, if not, in fact, better human beings. And for me, that's part of the appeal of at least thinking about changes like this, and maybe of this particular reform too.
Anyone else want to jump in on that?
Yeah. Kevin, go ahead.
I think inevitably this proposal of expanding the House of Representatives naturally leads to the question of, isn't it just going to exacerbate what we currently have? And why do we have what we currently have? Why do we have a legislature that's so severely polarized on high salience issues? Why do we have a legislature where so many members feel like their job is to raise money and just to follow, leadership's lead, as opposed to feeling like they actually have a significant stake in governing, and so on down the line. And, so yes, it is a danger. I would say if we just expanded the House and we did nothing else, this could, simply exacerbate the situation. But, if you're going to bring in a whole bunch of new members, I would think you would, of course, want to think about the incentives for how you could make them more likely to do the things the public wants and less likely to do the things that put us all off.
Craig asks, can the panelists comment on lessons learned from the U.S. state legislatures, which vary in size from 20 to 400 across chambers? What have been the outcomes for political power, representation, policy outcomes, given the different sizes there? And I always think about New Hampshire, which has, I think, 400 reps in its lower house, and New Hampshire, I don't know what the population of it is, but it's considerably smaller than that of the United States in total. And they managed to make it work. Anyway, is there a lesson to be learned about, if the point is making federal Congress more representative and more able to deal with constituent services, has that been borne out by how state legislatures work?
John, I think this kind of question puts a real clear point on something that we ought to be clear about, which is that there are two kinds of effects that the size of the legislature can have. One is on the legislature as a body, just a group of several hundred people working together. And the other is on its ability to represent its larger constituency, which can range from a small state like New Hampshire to the entire country, which is much larger and more vast. Part of the problem to be addressed by this kind of reform is that members represent too many people. And in that sense, you could say New Hampshire is an example. New Hampshire is a small state with 400-member lower house. The joke there is that everybody has their turn serving in the lower house of the legislature. But the fact is, people have a lot of contact with their member. They're likely to know their state legislator, which is not the case in most places. And in that sense, you could certainly say a larger number can improve representation. The question is whether it becomes unwieldy. You couldn't have that ratio for the House of Representatives, where you would end up with tens of thousands of members, and that kind of body just couldn't really function to enable face-to-face bargaining and negotiation, the sorts of things that you want at least some of in a legislature. And so I think the question is finding a balance between being representative of a larger society and yet still being functional as a body of human beings who have to negotiate with each other and work together somehow.
I would also, I think it's a fascinating question, and Yuval's right. There is a trade-off there between size of the legislature and connection to constituents. And the U.S. is, as we all know, is an extremely large country. But there's another important variable in there, which is the professionalization of the legislature and the issues that legislature is dealing with. So, New Hampshire is really a citizens' legislature. Extremely low pay, not a lot of resources. Whereas California, New York, Pennsylvania, some other states are highly professionalized legislatures. Particularly California. Now, are the outcomes of the California state legislature better than the outcomes of the New Hampshire state legislature? Depends on your politics, I suppose, to some extent. But it's also the case that the California state legislature is probably dealing with a much wider range of difficult questions, because how California's economy is regulated often winds up being the de facto way in which a lot of regulations work in the U.S., because a lot of companies make products just for if they're going to make the products for the California market, they might as well use those same manufacturing processes. So, the U.S., another problem of the U.S. legislature, and this is something that Kevin and I have been beating the drums on since we first met over coffee those many years ago, about the fact that the U.S. Congress doesn't invest enough in its own policymaking capacity. That's one question, is whether if you increase the number of members but don't increase the expertise and staff capacity, you may not be solving the problem. Now, a hope is that if you had more members, you'd also have more investment in staff capacity. And if you had more focus on committees and subcommittees, you would have more investment in staff capacity. And so you would have higher quality hearings than the one that Ruth is going over the transcripts for, in which, the reality is that a lot of what passes for hearings in Congress today is just the Democrats line up their experts and tell them what to say. The Republicans line up their experts and tell them what to say. And nobody pays attention other than to get in their zinger that they hope will wind up on YouTube or wherever. And then we all move on and nobody changes their opinion. So, this is, in some ways it's a question of it's not a kind of just add water and the little spongy dinosaur will keep growing and growing, but that it changes the way the institution functions and has a bunch of other downstream consequences, so that it is kind of as you were saying, Jonah, if we're in a log jam, you don't have to remove all the logs. You just remove a few of them, and then the water starts flowing, and that becomes easier to remove the others. And then we're in a different state. I mean, politics is a complex system, and as Ruth says, we all have to have some humility here about what these changes are going to lead to, and we can make our Zoom panel predictions, but we have to accept that things will always play out somewhat differently than we expect them to. But at the same time, I think it's pretty clear that what's happening now is a fundamental disaster for the long-running experiment of self-governance in the United States.
So Jerome asks a question that I think is a good one, and I think it feeds into how you could possibly sell, at the very least, segments of the Democratic Party on this, and possibly the Republican Party. He asks, do you agree that expanding the House would result in a greater probability of electing more minorities, including more women and younger folks, without long histories of previous election success, i.e. professional politicians? In other words, would you have a more representative Congress in the sort of demographic sense? And also, would it just be more truly new blood in terms of people from outside the usual channels, which I think can be a mixed blessing, but that could be a way to sell it. Have you run through, I mean, do we know that would be the case, or would it just create a little more bandwidth for the same professional politicians climbing the greasy pole that, tend to go to Congress anyway? Bueller? Anybody? All right.
I'm happy to weigh in on that question.
Okay.
I think there would be a more diverse group of people running for Congress, because you would draw from people who are younger, and the Congress right now is not very representative. It's much old. First of all, much older than the American. I mean, there's some extent to which Congress should be a little bit older and wiser, but there's a lot of very old people in Congress. It's much whiter, it's much more male, and if you look at the incoming classes of freshmen, particularly on the Democratic side, they always tend to be a lot more diverse in terms of a lot more women, a lot more people of color, a lot more people of different backgrounds. So I think it would absolutely make Congress more representative of the American people. As for the sort of like professional politicians, I think being politics is a skill, and the idea that we're going to have sort of amateurs coming in and then figuring things out, I would quibble with that. But I do think that there's a value in people who bring different life experiences. I mean, people get into politics for a lot of different reasons. I think we need to stop sort of trashing the idea that politicians are all bad, because it is a skill and it is a profession. And I want professional doctors if I go in for surgery. I want professional pilots if I'm flying in a plane. So I would like professional politicians making, tough compromise decisions in governing this governing
I don't know why. I thought we all just wanted people who were really good at TikTok videos. I thought that was the whole point of what Congress had in mind.
Yeah, I think your reading of the Federalist Papers may be different than mine.
If I could just piggyback on that for a sec, I mean, yeah, more seats is obviously more possibilities for diversity, but I think the bigger issue is that it gets back to what you've all highlighted earlier, which is that if this was rolled out, it would create a moment. It'd create a systemic disruption moment. Not least, you would have to create new districts, or you would have to start creating multi-member districts. And in which case that takes the chessboard in politics and kind of flips it. And that means people who may not have thought previously about getting into a race suddenly decide to do it. And, so I'm pretty confident that you would have a Congress that looks a little different than the current one that we have.
I would just add to this too that, we know that in districts where there is not an incumbent running, that you typically attract more quality candidates to run. It's perceived as, there's a fair shot at this. And so if we think about the increase in size is just opening up the number of, quote, open seats where there isn't an incumbent who's stifling competition, you might imagine that you're just going to get, I take Lee's point and I fully endorse it. You want good professional politicians, but the best ones are not going to run in races they think they're going to lose. And so if you have more open races, you may actually increase the number of truly qualified candidates, whether that necessarily redounds to the benefit of greater diversity in the ways we often think about it in Congress is, I suppose, more of an open question. I do think there's some evidence to think that at least when it comes to SES, that you would get a representative who is less likely to be well funded on their own, right? Like one of the things that's a particular concern is that members of Congress are just not representative of the constituents when it comes to sort of their own personal wealth. And so if we think that that leads to problematic policymaking, then, certainly increasing the number of candidates who are coming from a variety of different quarters would certainly it would be hard to see how that would be a bad thing, and probably would be ultimately a good thing.
So Yuval, at the beginning of this, you made the point that we've had these moments of reform in Congress, of sort of spontaneous, effervescent attempts at reform. We saw it in the 1970s. We saw it earlier. It seems to me, I'm not a close student of this, but it seems to me that in most of those periods, you had one party decisively dominating the House of Representatives, and you also had much more regular order type things going on. Given where the House is right now, can you actually imagine a Kevin McCarthy coming in as the new speaker and saying, okay, this is what we're going to do? Or if for some reason Nancy Pelosi holds on, I mean, just as not to descend into pure rank punditry, but it seems to me that this is not the most propitious time, even though I'm very much in favor of this, to get the institution to heal itself. Or am I missing something?
Well, the times when you need to heal are the times when you're sick. And I do think that there is there's a very broadly shared dissatisfaction with the status quo among members. There is not at the moment a broadly shared sense of how to improve things. And I think the reason to be talking about ideas like this now is to try to help members see that some of the dissatisfaction they feel could be addressed by reforms of the institution. For some, that would look like reforms of the budget process, which I think really is at the heart of what's now wrong in the House. For some, it might be reforms of the committee system, maybe ways of thinking about the role of leadership and other things. But there aren't a lot of members who are very happy with the status quo. And so I do think that it's incumbent upon those of us who think about Congress institutionally to be offering ideas at this point for how things could be changed. That's not to say that members are ready to go, or that you can easily imagine a cross-partisan coalition that unites around changes like this. I think that it is an advantage for a reform like this that it would not have an obvious partisan appeal, but it's also a disadvantage because it doesn't have an obvious appeal to either party. It's not a way that you can say to them, you're just more likely to win if you do this. I think that this reform, the way it's structured, takes seriously some of the concerns and incentives that members would face. For example, it doesn't eliminate existing seats. It doesn't take seats away from states, which means it's more likely that the existing Congress would be open to this because members wouldn't think that they would themselves lose their own seat under it. You're only expanding. I think we have
they
to
would also gain seniority immediately.
And you gain seniority immediately. I think we have to take the incentives they confront seriously. And, it's also always easy to say Congress used to be much more collaborative. There was a golden age. I hear that said now about the 1990s when I was a staffer in the House. And let me tell you, that was not a golden age. But there are a lot of people who say, well, back then the chairman and the ranking member would go to dinner all the time. That's great. But there are always problems. There are always problems. And in any moment, the ways that you think about how to change the system have got to be geared to the problems. It's not that we're trying to return to some age of perfection. It's that we're trying to deal with what's wrong now. And in that sense, I think we've got to start from a realistic assessment of just what you say, that this is not an obvious moment for bipartisan reforms to strengthen the institution, but also that this is when they're needed. So we have to think about how to make them more appealing to the existing Congress.
I would add something else, and I agree with Yuval. There is a group of members of Congress that calls themselves the Problem Solvers Caucus, and I know Ruth's been studying them, so I want to hear what she has to say about this. Who have been, I think, gamely trying to find a way to make the institution work, and sort of coming up short because there's not a lot of support for their efforts in a centralized party-driven Congress. But I could envision a scenario in which Republicans win a majority in the House, but that there's a faction of Republicans that refuses to endorse Kevin McCarthy as Speaker, and that there's a fair amount of intra-Republican fighting. And in that moment, problem solvers step up and say, okay, like here's another way to run Congress, and finds a kind of cross-partisan coalition to do that. Especially if maybe there's some independent, centrist, moderate Republicans who win some elections in 2022. And this is sort of, there's been a kind of long-standing attempt among some folks to find this kind of fulcrum of moderates who would hold the balance of power in either the Senate, the House, or both, to kind of use that organizing moment at the beginning of Congress to say, look, we're going to vote for whichever speaker is going to agree to these demands. Now, and as long as they're a small group, it's very easy to pick them off. And it's hard to be a dissenting member. It's much nicer to be a good team player on the party in charge. But if that number grows, and if there's more organization and determination, I could see a situation in which we wind up with something unpredictable. And to Yuval's point, not a lot of members are thinking about how to make the institution work better, but I think they're eager to hear from folks who are in that moment in which they're reaching for something to do in some way. And so, in politics, change happens slowly and then all at once. And the future belongs to those who are willing to think hard about what that future ought to be.
So Ruth, are the problem solvers the cavalry in this situation?
I think you need more than the problem solvers. I think they've certainly put on the record that they're not happy with the status quo, and are willing to be in the same room with members of the other party and talk about policy in a productive way. But I don't think that they're enough. I think the good news from both what Lee and Yuval have said is that the best news for everybody is that no one seems to be all that happy with the status quo. And so ideally one could find, there are a lot of institutional reforms that have passed in Congress through strange bedfellow coalitions, common carriers, where everyone finds enough of what to like in a change that you bring together odd groups of people who you wouldn't otherwise imagine collaborating. And I think that's the best case for this kind of reform. I think the bigger problem is actually just the amount of cynicism that members have that any kind of change is possible, that there's something better out there. And so I think, to Lee's point, one pitch for this report is just that it starts a conversation about things that people may not have thought about, that are more, both grander in scale and seemingly easier to understand than, say, small tweaks around the edges that I think would require an incredible amount of political capital, but probably wouldn't really materially change the experiences of individual members or their voters. And so here, the best thing you can say about this plan is that it is just crazy enough that it may actually be inspiring to people to do something about it, right? Like that it's not just another small tweak to improve capacity or the functioning of email on Capitol Hill or Office Space, all of which are incredibly important, but not particularly inspiring in the way that something like this might be. And so I think it's this sort of changing of a conversation that I think can yield coalition building that we haven't seen. And so it's possible that this is the kind of that you wouldn't see small scale changes, that if you were going to see changes, it would be big or nothing. And so that may be where we are.
So look, I mean, I come from a school of conservatism that thinks most new ideas are bad, and that's throwing out reforms to see what shakes loose is a bad approach to things. But one of the nice things about expanding the House is it's in fact a very old idea. It comes out of the Constitution. It's debated at the Constitutional Convention. And if you're going to take a flyer on an idea that only seems radical because of lethargy and status quo bias, but actually is in fact not, this seems like a great one to do. But that's just me. Kevin, you want to sort of wrap this up for everybody as our in-house Congress guy?
Oh yeah, sure. Just to build off of what Lee was observing and what Ruth was pointing out, the House has in it sort of a natural reset button that can be pushed to lead to structural changes, and that's the fact that every 2 years you have to create a new House and adopt new rules, and that involves a whole lot of bargaining. And one of the chief points of bargaining is who gets to be Speaker. And the reason we have a select committee on the modernization of Congress right now is we had some problem solvers and some new members who didn't feel beholden to Speaker Pelosi and said, look, we're going to withhold our votes unless we get certain reforms. One of those reforms was the select committee on the modernization of Congress. And so one could see that, you could bring about change by just saying, look, we got a bunch of new members and we want to have a vote on this scheduled at some point this year about expanding the House, or we want a select committee set up on this. And that can kind of get the ball rolling on this sort of thing so that eventually you can enact a statute that can lead to the House being expanded.
So we need to wrap up in a minute, but I feel bad that I have not asked this question at the very beginning, because I think it's actually one of the questions that a lot of normals have. And one of the problems that we have in our democracy right now is that the normals don't have enough representation. So what I've been talking about expanding the House for a long time, I often make jokes about how it's basically the tyranny of the fire marshal that limits the number of seats in the House. But that's not actually right. Robert asks, the House chamber has a finite physical size. If you return to a regime in which more members are added every 10 years after the census, at what point will they exceed the maximum safe capacity of the chamber? So literally, how many people can it hold? I don't think it really matters that much, but it's an interesting question. And I think a lot of normal people want to know is how many people can you fit in the room? And what do you do once you get past it?
Congress has faced this question before and has had to expand the House chamber. The House used to meet in what's now Statuary Hall, and it was quite roomy to begin with, and ultimately got very crowded. And the building was expanded in both directions. It created a new Senate chamber and a new House chamber, which they use now. The House chamber now is built in benches. You could fit more people, but not a lot more people. I think you'd have trouble fitting 150 more people on a regular basis in the House. Now, you very rarely see all the members in the House at any one time. The House of Commons chamber in Britain is actually built to house fewer than the number of members. They have 650 members. And by definition, but that is intentionally, the House chamber seats fewer members than the House has, so that those very rare occasions when everybody's there, it feels crowded and intense and like an important moment, and there are people standing. Maybe the fire marshal wouldn't allow that, but I don't think Congress should let the size of the existing room determine for itself how it should represent the public. If there's a need to expand, they know where to find architects.
Okay. Well, with that, and with Yuval's just callous disregard for fire safety, we're going to conclude this. I want to thank everybody for doing this. Starting again, ladies first, with Ruth Block-Rubin from the University of Chicago, with Lee Drutman, Yuval Levin, who were two of the authors of this report, and of course our own Kevin Kosar. Thank you all so much for tuning in, and I hope you'll come back for the next exciting AEI adventure.